Welcome once again to the Brownstone, Wolfe's sanctuary of logic, orchids, and murder. Do tell us where in the world you're listening from, and don't hesitate to share your thoughts. If you enjoy these cases, consider liking and subscribing. Now then, shall we begin? Nero Wolfe and the murder in Cramer's office. It was 12 minutes past midnight, which meant one of two things in Wolfe's brownstone. Either my milk had gone tepid, or trouble had arrived wearing perfume. I was at Wolfe's desk with the glass in my hand and his afternoon dictation stacked beside the blotter. He had gone up to bed an hour earlier, leaving me with the choice between cleaning up his sentences or cleaning out the icebox. I had just begun deciding whether to polish the prose or pour a refill when the telephone shrilled. Phones after midnight don't announce good tidings. Never have, never will. They're either a corpse calling collect, a crook borrowing time, or Inspector Cramer trying to shave another year off his life by yelling into the receiver. I scooped it up and said, "West 35th Street, Archie Goodwin presiding." The voice that came over was breathless, feminine, and carrying a tremor sharp enough to cut glass. No, scratch that. Wrong night. This time it was Cramer, and he sounded worse than any damsel in distress. The man has two registers, bark and growl, but tonight his bark was cracked at the edges, like a phonograph needle riding a warped groove. "Goodwin? Where the hell is Wolfe?" "In bed," I said, tipping back the last of the milk. "Dreaming of Roman legions or Sauerbraten. Take your pick." "Wake him, now!" That alone was worth a pause. Cramer doesn't order me to wake Wolfe. He usually demands Wolfe get off his backside, which is the surest waste of air in Manhattan. "Give me the pitch, Inspector. If it's a cat stuck in a tree, Fritz handles our humane calls. If it's a corpse, well, that's more your department." The sound that came back wasn't the usual explosion. It was something closer to gravel grinding under a boot. "There's been a killing in my office. My office, Goodwin. Get Wolfe down here. I don't care if you have to haul him in a wheelbarrow." That got me sitting straighter. I'd been expecting temper, not panic. Cramer's pride is built like the Brooklyn Bridge. Steel, rivets, and no room for cracks. If it had sprung one, something seismic had hit. "Hold it," I said. "Did I hear you right? Murder in the homicide office?" "You heard. Nathaniel Bryce, the lawyer, damn it, he's dead on my floor." For a second, the picture was too good to waste. Nathaniel Bryce, silver-haired ambulance chaser who made fortunes defending mobsters lying like an exhibit on Cramer's rug. No jury would acquit Cramer of bad luck. "Inspector, if I pass this along, Wolfe will have one of his spells. He'll declare the Constitution doesn't require him to leave the house and hang up on you. You want his help, you'll have to settle for my personal charm on location." "Goodwin," his voice cracked again. "You listen. They'll pin this on me unless Wolfe clears it. Get him down here." "Inspector, I'd sooner get the Statue of Liberty to jog across the harbour, but I'll come take a look. Where's Stebbins?" "Here, trying to keep the jackals out." "Good. Tell him to save me a seat." I hung up and looked at the empty glass. Milk was finished, but the night wasn't. I slipped into a raincoat, holstered the gun — it was the sort of night that might need it — and left the brownstone behind. Outside, Manhattan was washing itself in neon and rain. The storm had been brewing all evening, and now the streets were slick mirrors under street lamps. I took the Heron, gliding downtown through puddles that made the city look like it was drowning in its own light. It was close to 1 by the time I pulled up at police headquarters. The facade was lit like a prison gate, and the lobby buzzed with reporters chasing the scent of scandal. Upstairs in homicide, the scene was bedlam. Typewriters clattered like machine guns, phones rang off their hooks, and the room smelled of wet wool and tobacco. Pearly Stebbins was at the door, a bull in a cheap suit, jaw set tight as he kept the press from barging in. "Evening, Pearly," I said. "Or should I say, condolence calls accepted." He growled. "You got gall, Goodwin. Go on in. Cramer's chewing his cigars to sawdust." I passed him and stepped into the lion's den. Cramer's office was a wreck. The desk lamp threw a harsh cone of light onto the carpet, and in that circle sprawled Nathaniel Bryce. The man had been the slickest defense attorney in the city, silver hair combed like a movie star's, jaw square enough to chisel with. Now he was spread eagle near Cramer's desk, tie askew, eyes glassy. A toppled chair lay beside him, and in his right hand, crumpled like a last defense, was a torn sheet from a yellow legal pad. Cramer stood behind his desk, red as a fire hydrant, a cigar chewed down to the nub between his teeth. His coat was off, his sleeves rolled, and his face wore the look of a man accused of everything from jaywalking to treason. "About time," he barked at me. "Sorry, Inspector. Rain slowed me down. You should try umbrellas. They're marvellous things." "Cut the wisecracks. Where's Wolfe?" "In bed. Where sensible men stay at this hour." "You tell that fat slob. Hold it." I raised a hand. "If you want Wolfe's help, you don't get him by calling him names. You want me? I'm here. You want him? You've got to play the game his way." He slammed the desk with his fist. "Damn it, Goodwin, they'll railroad me. Internal Affairs, the DA, every paper in this town, they'll have my scalp nailed to the wall by morning. Bryce gets killed in my office, on my rug, and I'm supposed to look innocent. Hell!" I stepped closer to the body. The sheet in Bryce's hand had only 2 letters scrawled at the top. "R." The rest was torn away. "Friend of yours?" I asked. "Don't get cute. Bryce was supposed to testify to a grand jury tomorrow. About graft. Politicians, mobsters, maybe even cops. And now he's—" he jabbed a finger at the corpse. "Now he's this." "Well, Inspector, that's certainly inconvenient. For him, I mean. For you, it's catastrophic." He didn't bite at the sarcasm. His jaw worked the cigar until it snapped. "Goodwin, I need Wolfe. I don't care if I have to drag him here myself." "Try that," I said, "and you'll sprain something vital. He doesn't budge for kings, queens, or presidents. You think he'll budge for a homicide, Inspector?" Stebbins came in then, his bulldog face even gloomier than usual. "We got reporters sniffing at the door," he muttered. "They're already saying you did it, boss." Cramer swore loud enough to rattle the windows. I squatted beside Bryce, careful not to smudge the evidence. No bullet holes, no knife wounds, no blood at all. His lips were faintly bluish, though. "Poison, maybe," I said. "Quick one." Cramer glared. "You a coroner now?" "No, but I read books." I picked up the torn page with a handkerchief and studied it. "What's R? A name? A place? Maybe he was trying to write Archie, in which case I'm flattered but prefer fan mail delivered alive." Cramer made a sound halfway between a growl and a groan. "Quick crackin' wise, this is my hide." I stood, folded the page back into the handkerchief, and slid both into a large evidence envelope. "Chain of custody," I said, sealing it and handing it to Stebbins after he'd initialed the flap. "I'll get Wolfe a photograph." "Relax, Inspector. I'll show this to Wolfe. He'll either deduce the murder in 12 syllables or tell you to go to hell. Either way, you'll get an answer." Cramer lunged. "Give me that page." "Easy," I sidestepped. "Chain of custody, remember? You let the press know your prime suspect stole evidence and you'll be eating crow until retirement. Better to let me deliver it to Wolfe and see what he says." He deflated a little, like a balloon punctured by fact. "Goodwin, please, get him on this. I can't." His voice cracked again. That was the hook. The mighty Inspector Cramer, scourge of criminals, growler at Wolfe's door, was begging. "Fine," I said. "I'll tell him you came hat in hand. He may even smile before he refuses. Meanwhile, you keep your chin up. Nothing worse than a homicide inspector who looks guilty." I turned for the door. The room behind me was smoke, sweat, and a corpse on the carpet. Outside, the rain kept pounding like the city wanted to wash the night clean. Back in the Packard, I lit the engine and pointed it north. Wolfe would hate every syllable of the story, but he'd love the flavour. Inspector Cramer, cornered, desperate, and needing him like oxygen. If that didn't get him to nibble, nothing would. By the time I got back to the brownstone, it was 10 minutes past 1, and the rain had settled into a steady drizzle that gave the sidewalks the look of nickel plating. I hung up my coat, shook the water from my hat, and considered whether to rattle Wolfe out of bed with the news that his favourite sparring partner was now prime suspect in a midnight murder. Common sense won out. Wolfe in his nightgown was no sight I wanted etched into memory. Better to save the pleasure for breakfast, when he would have a bottle of beer at hand to wash down Cramer's humiliation. At 9:30 sharp the next morning, I found Wolfe where God and routine intended him to be, seated in the office, bulk folded into the yellow chair, dressing gown belted, slippers firm on the footrest, and his eyes moving slowly, almost reverently, down the columns of the Times. The orchids upstairs had already claimed their 2-hour tax. Now civilization could proceed. I had timed my entrance with the arrival of Fritz and a tray of chilled bottles. The glasses were frosted, and Wolfe had already extended a hand with the gravity of a monarch accepting tribute. He poured with the precision of a chemist, lifted the glass to his lips, and only then permitted me to speak. "Inspector Cramer sends his regards," I said, leaning back in my chair. "Or he would, if he had any left to send. He called me at 12:13 last night in a state that would have made Niagara Falls look like a dry faucet. There's been a murder in his office." The beer glass paused halfway down. Wolfe's lids narrowed, and he gave me one of those long, weighty stares that could fill 3 paragraphs in a Greek tragedy. "Archie," he said, voice soft and scornful, "you are jesting." "Not unless I'm a better comedian than you've given me credit for. Nathaniel Bryce, the silver-haired shyster who kept half the city's mobsters from enjoying Sing Sing accommodations. Dead as a doornail right on Cramer's rug. No gun, no knife, no blood. Just a toppled chair and a torn sheet from a legal pad." Wolfe set his glass down with exaggerated care. His fingers formed a steeple against his belly. "Bryce. Ha! That carrion feeder of the bar." His lips curled almost imperceptibly. "And Cramer presumes to invite me into his disgrace." He didn't invite, he begged. I could almost hear the hat twisting in his hands. He wanted you there in person. Wolfe's eyes closed. "Pfui. If I left this house at the behest of every panic-stricken public servant, I would be a shuttlecock, bandied about from morgue to station house. No." I leaned forward. "You're missing a sight you'd have paid admission for." Cramer red-faced, chewing his cigar to sawdust, his pride leaking out the soles of his shoes. A corpse in his office isn't just scandal. It's a Broadway flop, and he's the star. That earned me a flicker of interest. Wolfe inhaled deeply, exhaled through his nose like a bull deciding whether to charge or stay put. "Describe the page." I took the envelope from the drawer, unsealed it, and laid the scrap on the desk beside the photostat I'd made. The yellow paper had one scribble at the top. "R." Wolfe adjusted his position, extended a finger, but did not touch. He examined it as if the letters might rearrange themselves into revelation. "Legal pads," he murmured, "are not kept for decoration. In Bryce's office, or Cramer's, they are used to record information of consequence. A man does not begin a word, then expire without interruption. He was writing a name. He was prevented from completing it." "Sure," I said. "Arnie, Arson, Aristophanes. Could even be Archie. Nice to think of him using his last breath to memorialize me." "Fatuous," Wolfe snapped. "You said there was no weapon visible." "Correct. No gun, no blade, no strangler's cord." His lips had a bluish tinge. My untrained guess. Poison. Then the interruption was abrupt indeed. Poison seldom waits upon convenience. He must have been surprised in the act of betraying his murderer. I let that roll around the room a moment. Wolfe leaned back, retrieved his glass, and took a slow draught. The office clock ticked a neat tattoo. "Well," I said, "you've had your morning exercise. What's the verdict? Do we help Cramer out of his jam or let him stew?" Wolfe's gaze turned downward, contemplative. "Cramer is an exasperating man. Obdurate, obstreperous, irreverent. Yet, desperation ill becomes him. It is rare. Rare enough that I'd have bottled it if I could. But Inspector Desperate is what you've got. He's expecting you'll appear with fanfare and pull his bacon from the fire." Wolfe's lip curled again. "Appear? In his office? Absurd. I will not. If he desires my intervention, he must abase himself here, in my chair, at my terms." Which, translated, means we sit and wait until he stomps in chewing a fresh cigar down to the wrapper. "Precisely." Wolfe tugged at the bell cord. Fritz reappeared, bearing a small plate of cheese straws, and set them within reach. Wolfe selected one as if it were the coronation sceptre of Hungary. I tapped the desk with a fingertip. "Just so you know, Cramer isn't just worried about press clippings. Internal Affairs will be measuring his coffin before dawn. Bryce was due to sing to the grand jury about corruption, and now he's the one off stage. If the papers run with that, Cramer's finished." Wolfe chewed, swallowed, and took another draught of beer. His tone was almost meditative. "Then, Archie, prepare yourself. He will come, he will rage, and he will implore. The spectacle should amuse you." I sat back and folded my arms. Amuse, maybe, but this case has teeth. The note, the missing weapon, the lack of witnesses. It's got the makings of a circus. "Every crime is a circus," Wolfe said wearily. The performers change, the pattern remains. That was Wolfe for you. Serene disdain wrapped around a brain sharp enough to split atoms. He was already retreating into silence, the kind that filled the office like incense. I knew better than to push. I rose, gathered the scrap back into its handkerchief, and slipped it into the safe. If Cramer wanted it, he'd have to ask Wolfe for it personally. The clock chimed 11. Wolfe heaved his bulk from the chair, gathered his robe, and announced, "My orchids require me." That was the curtain drop, as final as any judge's gavel. He waddled to the elevator, pressed the button, and ascended to his morning kingdom of blossoms, leaving me to the typewriter, the rain still ticking at the window, and the certainty that Inspector Cramer, sooner rather than later, would come barging in with all the fury of a man who knows the axe is aimed squarely at his own neck. At precisely 10:52 that morning, the brownstone doorbell gave out a blast loud enough to rattle the orchids upstairs. Fritz was in the kitchen preparing something with enough aroma to stir even a corpse, so naturally it fell to me to answer. When I swung the door, I wasn't surprised to see Inspector Cramer filling the stoop, trench coat dripping, hat jammed low, and a cigar clamped in his teeth like it had borrowed money he intended to collect. "Goodwin," he growled, barging in before I had the chance to step aside. "Where is he?" "In the office," I said. "Where else would he be at this hour? We don't keep a kennel, so he doesn't have walkies." He stomped past, bringing with him a trail of wet wool, smoke, and enough fury to fumigate the hallway. I followed because it's my job to see the lions safely into the ring. Wolfe was already in his chair, naturally, as immovable as Mount Vernon. He didn't even glance up when Cramer burst in. He simply marked his place in the Gazette, laid it aside, and waited for the performance. "Damn it, Wolfe!" Cramer roared. "You heard about Bryce. This is a frame-up. They'll have my badge in a week unless you get off your fat backside and clear me." Wolfe raised his lids half an inch. "Inspector, if you expect succor, kindly refrain from commencing with invective." He gestured at the red leather chair opposite. "Be seated, if you can comport yourself." Cramer sat, though the springs squealed under protest. He gnawed the cigar to a pulp and jabbed a finger. "Internal Affairs is sniffing already. The Commissioner's calling for reports. The DA's office is sharpening its knives. You think I can stand alone against that storm?" "Then you should have thought twice before inviting a corpse into your office," Wolfe murmured. That nearly popped a blood vessel. I could see the veins stand out on his neck. Before he could erupt again, I slid in smoothly. "Inspector, you might try lowering the volume. Wolfe charges by the decibel." "Phooey," Wolfe said, waving me down. He folded his hands. "You desire my professional services. Very well. My fee is $30,000 retainer." Cramer choked. 30, good Lord, are you insane? That's more than my yearly salary." "Which is not my affair," Wolfe said calmly. "You enter here not as an officer of the law, but as a client in extremis. For my intervention, I require compensation proportionate to the risk and the offence of your presumption." Cramer's cigar nearly disintegrated under the assault of his molars. "You bloodsucker! You'd skin your own grandmother for profit." I grinned. "I've seen him skin a chicken for less, Inspector. Take my advice. Pay the man before he raises it to 50. Cramer wheeled on me, but Wolfe's hand rose. "Enough. You have a choice, sir. Retain me or do not. But if you withhold a scintilla of fact, if you seek to manipulate me, I will withdraw, retainer notwithstanding, and you may contend alone with your bureaucrats and journalists." The office went still except for the faint tick of the wall clock. Cramer's shoulders slumped, but only slightly. He was a man cornered, pride and rage wrestling with necessity. "All right," he spat. "You'll have it. 30,000. Just get me clear." "Excellent." Wolfe reached for the bell cord and tugged. "Fritz will bring pen and paper for a receipt. Archie, you will prepare a memorandum." "Of course," I said, swivelling toward the typewriter. "Shall I put it under clients, reluctant and combustible?" Cramer growled, but the fight had gone out of him. He yanked the ruined cigar from his mouth, slammed it into the ashtray, and leaned forward. "Listen, Bryce wasn't just any stiff. He was going to testify this morning, before the grand jury." That got Wolfe's full attention. His brows lifted, eyes narrowing to slits. "On what subject?" Cramer hesitated, then swore. "Mob bribery. Payoffs from the unions. Kickbacks through construction firms, political grease, the whole rotten system. He was going to spill names. I whistled. And then he turns up poisoned on your rug. That's not just inconvenient, Inspector, that's Shakespeare. Shut up, Goodwin, Cramer barked. He dragged a hand across his forehead. The point is, half the city had motive to silence him. And where does it happen? In my office. My office. Wolfe tapped a finger against the armrest. Indeed, which suggests deliberate design. Someone engineered his presence there at that hour, knowing the consequences. Cramer stared, then banged a fist. Exactly. That's what I've been trying to say. But no one will believe me unless you back me up. Patience, Wolfe murmured. I have not yet agreed to exonerate you, only to investigate. That lit the fuse again, but he swallowed it barely. Fine. Investigate, but do it fast. They'll have me on suspension by the end of the week. At that moment, Fritz entered with a tray, setting down small sandwiches and fresh beer. Wolfe signed the receipt with a flourish, and Cramer scribbled his name. The receipt listed the Police Benevolent Association and 2 anonymous donors. There, he said. You're on the hook now, Wolfe. I don't care how you do it. Just clear me. Wolfe inclined his head, regal as ever. I shall endeavour, Inspector, but remember, if you prevaricate, I will not save you from your own folly. Cramer surged his feet, trenchcoat flapping. Just get results. And soon. He stormed out, slamming the door so hard a book fell from the shelf. I retrieved it, slid it back, and looked at Wolfe. Well, I said, that went smoothly. 30 grand smoother, in fact. Wolfe sipped his beer and closed his eyes. Archie, prepare a list. We require Bryce's associates, enemies, and clients. And we require discretion. Begin with his law office. I nodded. Sure. And what about Cramer? You really going to clear him? His eyes opened, glittering. That will depend, Archie, on whether he deserves clearing. That was Wolfe for you. A man who could turn a desperate cop's plea into a business transaction and a moral puzzle, all before lunch. When Wolfe dispatched me to Bryce's law office on Madison Avenue, it was with the regal air of a man granting permission to his lieutenant to go tilt at windmills. He had already withdrawn to the Orchids for the 4 to 6 p.m. vigil, which meant I had a clear window to make myself useful, or at least appear so on the expense account. The Bryce and Marston offices occupied a suite on the 12th floor of a building that had more marble in its lobby than Rome, and more brass polish than the US Navy. The reception area was all hushed carpets, deep leather chairs, and a wall of law books arranged for their covers rather than their contents. If a single one of them had been cracked open in the last decade, I'd have eaten Fritz's strudel with mustard. Miss Hale, the secretary, had the look of a woman who had learned composure by practicing in a mirror until the edges froze. Neat blonde hair, glasses perched just so, voice pitched to cool civility. She lifted her head when I gave my name, and for a moment the mask slipped. Something sharp and nervous flickered behind her eyes. Mr. Marston will see you, she said. The voice was steady, but her hands fumbled the papers on her desk, stacking them twice before they stayed in place. Charles Marston, Bryce's surviving partner, received me in an office designed for intimidation. Polished mahogany desk, a bronze scale of justice on the credenza, and a portrait of himself that looked like it had been commissioned from a painter who charged extra for smugness. He was tall, sleek, and so smooth he could have slid uphill in silk socks. Mr. Goodwin, he said, extending a hand as if greeting a golf partner. Terrible business, this tragedy. Poor Nathaniel. Shocking. Yeah, I said, taking the chair opposite him. He didn't look his best sprawled on Cramer's carpet. The smile faltered a fraction, then returned with professional brightness. You were there? Front row seat, I said. And believe me, Inspector Cramer didn't enjoy playing host. Marston's eyes flickered just a touch. The inspector must be beside himself. More like under himself, I said. But let's get to brass tacks. Bryce was scheduled to appear before a grand jury this morning. Know anything about that? His laugh was soft, almost pitying. Rumours. Nathaniel was often the subject of them. But a grand jury? Absurd. He had no reason to involve himself in such matters. Funny. That's exactly what Cramer's not saying. The smooth veneer held, but the fingers drumming lightly on the desktop betrayed a quicker pulse. Well, if you're here to gather gossip, Mr. Goodwin, I'm afraid you'll leave disappointed. My late partner was a man of great discretion. Sure, I said. Discretion and mob clients go together like gin and tonic. By the way, nice office you've got here. Those cabinets locked for show or substance. That earned me the first real crack. He stiffened. Those contained sensitive records. Client privilege, you understand. I got up, wandered over and ran a finger along the polished wood. There was a neat row of ledgers bound in green leather, each one numbered in gold, all except for one slot, glaringly empty. Sensitive records, sure, I said, but this one looks like it went out for a walk. Marston was on his feet instantly, voice sharp. That's preposterous. Nothing is missing. I turned, eyebrows raised. I didn't say missing. I said it looked like it went out. You jumped to missing awful fast. He realized it too because the colour rose in his face. He smoothed his tie, forcing calm. The firm's records are in order. If a volume is being rebound, that is hardly unusual. Of course, I said agreeably. Law offices do like to keep their books looking fresh for the jury. Miss Hale chose that moment to enter with coffee. Her hand trembled as she set it down, and a drop sloshed onto the saucer. She whispered an apology, then retreated quickly. I sipped. It was good, strong, and hot enough to scald. So, about that grand jury. Marston shook his head, cutting me off. You're wasting your time. Nathaniel was a brilliant lawyer, but no martyr. If you're sniffing for conspiracy, I suggest you look elsewhere. Thanks, I said, rising. But conspiracy's a broad field, and I make it a habit to start where the soil smells richest. He escorted me to the door with the politeness of a man kicking someone down the stairs in his imagination. Miss Hale kept her head bent over her typing as I passed, but I caught the way her shoulders hunched, like a woman carrying too much knowledge and not enough courage. Back on Madison Avenue, I lingered under the awning a moment, watching the grey sky fray at the edges, then headed for the Packard. The office had given me more than coffee. Bryce's missing ledger wasn't just paper, it was a hole shaped like motive. And Marston's reaction hadn't been smooth at all. It had been panic with a silk hat. By the time I climbed into the Packard, I knew Wolfe would want a full report before dinner, and I knew he'd take one look at my description of the empty slot and pronounce it the hinge on which the whole bloody case turned. The legal world, I decided, was less a temple of justice than a theatre where the props were ledgers, the actors wore pinstripes, and the script was written in disappearing ink. And someone, somewhere, was tearing out the crucial pages before opening night. By the time I got back to the brownstone, dusk had slid over Manhattan like a grey blanket with neon stitching. The city was out there buzzing, but our house on 35th Street was ticking along on the Wolfe timetable, which meant the orchids were in session from 4 to 6. If a corpse had walked into the office carrying a confession, it would have been told to sit quietly until the blooms were satisfied. So I trudged upstairs to the plant rooms. The warm, damp air hit me first, the smell of loam, blossoms, and the faint chemical tang of fertilizers Theodore Horstman used under Wolfe's watchful eye. Wolfe himself stood before a bench of cattleyas, a hand lens glinting in the overhead light, adjusting the wire on a delicate blossom with the same reverence a bishop might show the chalice. "You are back," he said without turning. "Report." I leaned against the doorframe, hands in pockets. Bryce's office was everything you'd expect. Leather chairs, law books polished more than opened, and a secretary who looked ready to faint at the word grand jury. The partner, Charles Marston, was smoother than Fritz's custard, but twice as nervous once I mentioned ledgers. Funny thing, there's a whole row of them, bound in green, numbered in gold, only one slot empty. When I pointed it out, Marston jumped like I'd fired a starter pistol. Wolfe adjusted another wire, hummed, and still didn't look at me. That, Archie, is telling. Ledgers are not mislaid lightly. In the practice of law, they are as orchids, fragile repositories requiring constant care, and when one is removed, the gap proclaims itself. "Yeah," I said. "Fragile's the word." Miss Hale dropped coffee when she came in. Between her nerves and Marston's temper, the place looked more like a vaudeville act than a law office, but neither admitted Bryce was set to sing before the grand jury. Wolfe finally turned, squinting at me as though I were a particularly stubborn blossom. Of course not. If they acknowledged it, they would acknowledge the peril, and the missing volume becomes more intriguing. "Sure," I said. So intriguing that when I mentioned it, Marston got as red as Cramer's face after 3 cigars. He covered by claiming it was out for rebinding. "Ha," Wolfe grunted. "A feeble falsehood. Ledgers are not rebound singly, nor during an investigation of murder." I watched him poke at a bloom with a bamboo skewer and thought about the scrap of paper still locked in the safe downstairs. Speaking of falsehoods, the page Bryce left behind had R written on it, which could mean anything from Archie to Aristotle. Wolfe gave me the full weight of his scowl. Nonsense. Not Aristotle. He was not writing a treatise, but a name. Okay. It could have been Arnold, Arden, Arson, or maybe Archie. Don't smirk. I like the idea of my name being a man's dying declaration. Pfui, Wolfe returned to his plant. Do not indulge in frivolity. The name is crucial. He began it under duress, and it was interrupted. We must discover which R warrants murder. You want me to type up a list of R's in the Manhattan directory? That'll keep me busy until next Christmas. His brows lifted. Archie, confine yourself to sense. We require focus. Arden perhaps, or Arnold. Better yet, Arden Chemicals. Yes. The firm was mentioned in certain financial rumours. I straightened. Chemicals, eh? That wasn't in the script I saw today. Because you were looking at actors, Wolfe snapped. The play is staged elsewhere. If a ledger is missing, it was removed to erase evidence of transactions. Bryce was about to testify. The inference is obvious. I let out a low whistle. All right, suppose that's true. Who do we trust to poke around without rattling the cages? Saul Panzer, Wolfe said instantly. Discreet, resourceful, reliable. He will trace Arden Chemicals and its affiliations. I nodded. Saul was the best in the game, and half the time you forgot he was in the room until he handed you a clue polished and ready for Wolfe's use. You want me to call him now? Yes. Wolfe checked his watch. It is 5:30. He may begin tonight. I made a note to phone Saul the minute I got downstairs, then lingered in the humid room watching Wolfe nudge a blossom as if persuading it to testify. You know, I said, you treat those orchids like suspects, delicate, stubborn, full of secrets. You prod them, coax them, and occasionally shout "phooey" at them. Wolfe's eyes narrowed, but his tone was almost indulgent. Archie, orchids are repositories of purity. Suspects are repositories of lies. To equate them is impudent. Yet, the metaphor has value. Each bloom is singular, like a ledger. Remove one, and the balance is disturbed. Fine, I said. But if you start calling them to the witness stand, I'm out. He grunted, which for Wolfe was as good as a chuckle. The elevator took us back down to the office at 6 sharp. I called Saul, gave him the skinny, and told him to keep his hat brim low and his ears open. He said he'd start with bank records and corporate filings, and I hung up feeling reassured. If anyone could find a chemical company's dirty laundry, it was Saul. Wolfe lowered himself into the yellow chair with a sigh that could have rattled the windows. Archie, write a memorandum. Title it Arden Hypothesis. Note the missing ledger, Marston's agitation, and the possibility that ARM refers to a corporate entity. Sure, I said, rolling a sheet into the typewriter. Shall I add that Marston nearly fainted at the word ledger? Yes, exaggerate only slightly. The clatter of keys filled the office while Wolfe reached for a fresh beer. He drank slowly, eyes closed, already weaving deductions in that head of his. I typed up the report, signed it neatly, and placed it on his desk blotter. At exactly 7:01, he leaned forward, tapped the paper and said, Archie, tomorrow we must speak with Bryce's widow. She will tell us something she does not mean to. Why tomorrow? I asked. Because it is nearly dinner, and I will not contaminate Fritz's sauerbraten with rancid talk of lawyers. That was Wolfe. Bodies in police offices, ledgers missing, and a cop dangling by his badge, all secondary to the ironclad rule of dinner at 8. I closed the safe, switched off the typewriter, and poured myself a glass of milk. Fine, but don't blame me if Cramer barges in with ulcers before dessert. He muttered something in Latin that sounded suspiciously like, let them stew. Dinner bell rang from the kitchen. Fritz's voice floated up the hall, announcing sauerbraten and potato dumplings. Wolfe rose like a sultan summoned to court. The case could wait. Orchids had been tended, suspicions planted, and Saul was on the trail. The brownstone door was shut against the city's chaos, and the next move, as always, belonged to Wolfe. Park Avenue at 8 o'clock in the evening is the kind of street that thinks it invented class. The canopies stretch out like red carpets, the doormen look like toy soldiers, and the elevators whisper instead of groan. Bryce's penthouse sat on the top floor of one of the sleekest towers, a palace of glass and marble high above the dirty sidewalks. If you needed proof the man had never lost a case that paid, you only had to ride up and see how the other half lived. Mrs. Nathaniel Bryce, widow as of last night, received me in a sitting room the size of a ballroom, dripping with crystal, silver, and a chandelier that looked like it could drop and wipe out a small town. She was a sight herself, raven-haired, cheekbones sharp enough to slice a lemon, dressed in black silk and diamonds large enough to make De Beers jealous. If grief had touched her, it had politely knocked and been told to come back later. "Mr. Goodwin," she said, extending a languid hand. "Do sit. This has all been so ghastly. I can hardly breathe." I sat, careful not to sink too deep into the cushions, and gave her the professional smile. "I'll keep the questions short then. Your husband had enemies?" Her laugh tinkled like glass about to crack. "Enemies? Nathaniel? Everyone admired him. He was generous, charming, a devoted husband." I raised an eyebrow. "You don't say." Her eyes flickered. Just a fraction, enough to tell me the generous and devoted part was a bit of theatre. I let it go. "And yet he wound up poisoned in Cramer's office. Doesn't sound like admiration to me." She reached for a long cigarette holder, lit up, and exhaled a ribbon of smoke. "There must be some mistake. Nathaniel was always careful." "Careful how?" "About appearances, about whom he associated with. If he kept secrets, it was only to protect me." I believed the last part, but not in the way she intended. Dinner was announced by a maid who looked as though she'd been drilled by the Marines. We moved into a dining room where the table was already set for two, candles flickering, wine chilled, silver gleaming. Widow Bryce had apparently decided my visit was social as well as professional. I wasn't about to turn down steak and a 1942 Bordeaux, so I took my place opposite her and let her pour on the charm. Between bites she dropped tidbits like pearls, though half of them were glass. Nathaniel loved the theatre. We were at the Winter Garden only last week. He adored the city, you know, always working, always entertaining. Such a whirlwind. I let her spin for a while, then steered the wheel. "Did he mention any appointments last night, before his untimely curtain call?" She dabbed at her lips too casually. "No, he was here, with me." The pause was too long, the delivery too smooth. I kept my fork steady and my eyes steady on hers. Funny, because rumour has it he was seen at Raven's. Her hand jerked, rattling the silverware. She recovered quickly, but not quick enough. "Raven's? That dreadful place? Impossible." "Then you won't mind me asking why a matchbook from Raven's was among his effects, gold embossed with the new logo. Hard to miss." She went pale beneath the rouge. I don't know how it got there." "Sure you do," I said lightly. "He met someone there. Someone he didn't want you, or anyone, to know about. That's not dreadful, Mrs. Bryce. That's just New York." Her eyes hardened. "You don't understand. He had to be careful. Clients, business. If word got out—" "There it is," I said. "Scandal. You're not afraid of the truth. You're afraid of headlines. The difference matters." She snapped her gaze away, fixing it on the chandelier as though the crystals might descend and rescue her. "Mr. Goodwin, I beg you, leave that place out of it. Raven's is nothing but shadows and lies, please." "Shadows and lies are my bread and butter, and Wolfe's." She flinched at the name. That man, Nathaniel loathed him. "Join the club," I said. "Most of New York loathes Wolfe, that's why he's useful. Now, I won't press further tonight, but remember, if your husband was keeping appointments at Raven's, someone there may have a longer memory than you'd like." The rest of the meal was small talk and big silences. She prattled about Paris gowns, Palm Beach, a trip to Havana. None of it mattered. What mattered was the way she couldn't quite keep her eyes from darting to the corner of the room where a half-burned envelope peeked out from a tray of correspondence. I didn't push, not yet. I had enough. A slip about Ravens, a lie about last night, and a widow more concerned with society pages than with a husband-turned-corpse. At 10 o'clock sharp, I rose. "Thank you for dinner, Mrs. Bryce. The steak was excellent. The company, well, let's say it was illuminating." Her smile was brittle as ice. "I trust you'll be discreet?" "Always, until it's useful not to be." Downstairs, the doorman whistled up a cab. As we slid through the wet streets, I thought about Ravens, smoky, loud, filled with half-truths and whole lies. Bryce had gone there for a reason, a secret meeting before his testimony, and now he was dead. By the time I reached the brownstone, Wolfe was already in his chair, a fresh beer at hand. I gave him the report. He listened with eyes closed, nodding only when I mentioned the matchbook. "A trifling object," he said, "but it speaks volumes. Ravens will be our next locus." "Great," I said. "Neon lights, cheap gin, and gangsters who don't like questions. Just where I like to spend my evenings." "Archie," Wolfe said, lifting his glass, "if you feared discomfort, you would have chosen another vocation." I grinned, poured myself milk, and settled in. Yeah, but then I'd have missed steak on Park Avenue and lies served with Bordeaux. Call it professional hazard. Ravens was the sort of joint that had once been a speakeasy and hadn't bothered to change its stripes when Prohibition retired. The neon over the door flickered Ravens in blood-red letters that dripped light down the wet pavement like a fresh wound. Inside, the air was a fog of cigarette smoke, perfume, and gin strong enough to start engines. A jazz combo was grinding out something sultry, the trumpet player leaning into every note like he was confessing sins. I took a booth near the back, ordered milk just to watch the waiter's eyebrows do acrobatics, and waited. It didn't take long. Places like Ravens run on gossip the way taxis run on gasoline, and strangers attract moths. The moth in question was a slick character with a pencil moustache and a tie loud enough to wake the dead. He slid into the booth without asking, grinning with too many teeth. "You're Goodwin, ain't you? Wolfe's legman." "Depends who's asking," I said. "Name's Joey Pardo. I knew Bryce. Poor sap was in deep with the wheel. Couldn't shake the dice if you glued his hands shut. Word is he owed a bundle, and the boys finally collected." I sipped my milk and nodded sympathetically. "Sure, gambling debts. That explains why he was found in Cramer's office with no chips, no cards, and no bruises. Makes perfect sense." Joey blinked, then laughed too loudly. "Details, details, you know how it is. The mob don't need to leave a calling card." The performance was so rehearsed I half expected him to hand me a script. Somebody had sent Joey to plant the gambling story, hoping I'd bite. I didn't. But I let him talk, nodding and throwing in the occasional "uh-huh," until he got bored and drifted toward the bar. That was when the real music came on stage. A singer in a green satin gown stepped into the spotlight. She had a voice like smoke and honey, and she knew how to use it. After her first number, I signaled the waiter and sent over a bill folded around a request. She glanced my way, arched a brow, and later drifted over, perfume trailing like a second dress. "You wanted a word, mister?" she asked, sliding into the booth. "Name's Goodwin. I'm interested in your late patron, Nathaniel Bryce. You saw him here last night?" She leaned back, eyes sharp despite the soft voice. "I see a lot of men here, but him, I remember. Silver hair, expensive suit. He didn't belong, but he came anyway. Met someone." "Who?" "Not a mobster, if that's what you're hoping. This was no thug. Tall guy, smooth, pinstripe suit, gold watch chain catching the light. They argued in the corner booth. Bryce kept saying something about not waiting any longer. The other man kept telling him to keep quiet." "Recognize him?" She shook her head. "Lawyer type, though, too polished for the crowd." I filed that away. Charles Marston, smooth as silk, had worn a gold watch chain when I met him. It was the kind of clue Wolfe would savour with his beer. "Anything else?" I asked. She tapped a lacquered fingernail against the table. "Just this. Bryce left first. He looked rattled. The other man stayed, ordered another drink, then left 10 minutes later. He looked pleased with himself." That was enough to tighten the net. Gambling debts. Phooey. Bryce hadn't been rolling dice, he'd been rolling the dice on whether to keep a secret or expose it. I thanked her, slipped her another bill, and left. Joey Pardo tried to intercept me at the door, still peddling his mob debt story, but I brushed past. The neon outside hissed in the rain, the city steaming and glittering under the drizzle. Back at the brownstone, it was close to midnight. Wolfe was waiting in his chair, robe belted, eyes half closed as though he'd been meditating on the sins of mankind. The orchids had been put to bed. Now it was my turn to perform. "Well?" he demanded, as Fritz set down a late tray of cold chicken and a fresh bottle of beer. "Bryce wasn't gambling," I said. "At least not with dice. He was at Ravens meeting a man in a lawyer's pinstripe. Tall, smooth, gold watch chain. Argued with him, then left rattled. The man stayed behind, looking like the cat that ate the canary. Wolfe's eyes opened fully, gleaming. Marston. Looks like it. I poured myself a glass of milk and grinned. So much for mob debts. Somebody fed me that line, hoping I'd bite. Red herring, Wolfe said, as always. He lifted his glass, sniffed and sipped. But the watch chain, vanity betrays more than vice. We are on the scent, Archie. We are on the scent. And with that, he waved me into silence, focused on his beer, and left me to wonder whether Marston's chain would hang him before the case was through. I filed my notes, shut the safe on the bank copies, and let the night go cold around the brownstone windows. The call came at 9:15 the next morning, just as I was clearing the breakfast tray. Wolfe had settled into his chair with the Times spread across his midsection. Fritz had retreated to the kitchen, and I was halfway through my second glass of milk. The phone shrilled, and I scooped it up, already suspecting it would be Cramer, since he was the only man in Manhattan cranky enough to ring at such an hour. "Goodwin," I said. The voice that came back wasn't Cramer's bark, though. It was Pearly Stebbins, sounding like he'd just bit through his own tongue. "Archie, you better haul yourself down to Marston's office, now. He's dead." That took the starch out of the milk. "Marston? Bryce's partner?" "Yeah, poison. Bourbon in his decanter. Place is crawling with cops." "Dandy," I said. 2 lawyers in 2 nights. At this rate the Bar Association will need a hearse committee. I hung up and relayed the news. Wolfe lowered the paper slowly, his eyes like twin gimlets. "Twice?" "Twice," I said. "Marston in his office with poisoned bourbon. You could almost sell tickets." "Phooey," Wolfe grunted. "And Cramer?" "Still suspect number 1, I'd wager. 2 dead lawyers, and the police don't exactly see Bryce's old partner as a charity case." Wolfe shut his eyes and pressed his fingers together. "Archie, go, observe, return, and note everything." So I went. Marston's office on Madison was already a circus when I got there. Squad cars lined the curb, uniforms blocked the lobby, and reporters buzzed outside like flies on a bakery window. I flashed my license at the desk sergeant and rode the elevator up, where Stebbins was waiting with a jaw like a slab of concrete. "Inside," he said grimly. The scene was textbook noir. The office smelled of scorched paper and liquor. Marston was sprawled in his leather chair, eyes glazed, one hand still resting on a heavy crystal tumbler. The bourbon decanter beside him was half empty, but the rim glistened with an odd film. On the far side of the office, the safe door yawned open like a mouth that had screamed too late. Its interior was charred, the ledgers and papers reduced to brittle ash. Cramer stood by the window, chewing a cigar to rags. His face was purple, his fists clenched. He swung on me the moment I entered. Two of them, Goodwin, and they still want me in irons. What the hell kind of city is this?" "The kind that keeps me employed," I said, moving closer to the desk. "Poison in the bourbon, you said?" Stebbins grunted. "Yeah, Doc tested it already. Cyanide. Bitter almond whisper on the rim." I bent over the safe. Amid the ruin, one small scrap had survived, half-burned, edges curling. I teased it out with a pencil and laid it on the blotter. 2 words were still legible. Arden Chemicals. Well, I said softly. Cramer stormed over. "What is it?" "A clue," I said, "unless you think Marston was planning to remodel his office with industrial solvents." His eyes bulged. "Chemicals? Bah! That don't prove anything. Half the city uses 'em." "Sure," I said, "but Bryce tried to write R before someone cut him off, and now Marston's safe coughs up Arden Chemicals. You don't need Wolfe to tell you those dots connect." "Phooey, Wolfe." Cramer spat the name like poison. "I don't care what that overfed jackass thinks." But his voice broke off. He knew as well as I did that Wolfe's thoughts were the only lifeline he had left. I spent another half-hour canvassing the office. The secretary, Miss Hale, had arrived white-faced, repeating that she knew nothing. The janitor swore he'd seen no one enter after 9 the night before. The decanter itself was clean except for the poisoned rim, wiped carefully, like someone had prepared the scene. At 11:15 I headed back to the brownstone. Wolfe had retired upstairs, so I typed up a memorandum at the desk. Subject, Marston. Condition, deceased. Method, cyanide bourbon. Safe contents, destroyed, except for fragment reading, Arden Chemicals. Conclusion, murder number 2. By the time Wolfe descended at 11:50, I had the memo waiting. He read it silently, lips pressed tight. At 12:10 he finally spoke. "Fire," he said, "is the coward's accomplice. It erases not merely paper, but intention." "Yeah," I said, "but it didn't quite finish the job. Arden Chemicals survived." Wolfe's eyes gleamed. "Indeed. So the name was too dangerous to live, even in ink. Someone has gone to extraordinary lengths." At that moment, the door burst open and Cramer stormed in, chewing his cigar to shreds. He slapped the desk hard enough to rattle the ink bottle. "Wolfe, you hear about Marston? That makes 2, and they're still looking at me like I'm the executioner." Wolfe's lids drooped. "Inspector, control yourself. If you rupture a vessel on my carpet, I shall be severely displeased." "Control? Control? They're saying Bryce and Marston both were about to sing on the grand jury. They think I silenced them to save my own hide." "Did you?" Wolfe asked blandly. "Hell no," Cramer roared. "Goodwin, tell him." "I'll tell him you were purple enough to burst a vein," I said. "As for guilt, I'll let him decide." Cramer dropped into the red leather chair and buried his face in his hands. "Wolfe, for God's sake, you've got to clear me. This ain't just internal affairs anymore. The DA wants my badge, my badge." Wolfe raised a finger. "Inspector, you have retained me. I shall proceed. But you will refrain from insults and concealments. If I learn you have suppressed so much as a rumour, I shall withdraw instantly." Cramer groaned, then nodded. "Fine, fine." "Now," Wolfe said, "the burned safe, the fragment, Arden Chemicals. What is its connection?" Cramer hesitated. "Bryce. He mentioned it once. Said they were laundering money through construction contracts. Kickbacks, mob fronts, political payoffs. I didn't believe him, but maybe—" "Phooey," Wolfe interrupted. "You believe nothing until it explodes in your face." I leaned against the desk. "So Bryce wanted to testify. Marston tried to cover it up. Now they're both dead, and the only survivors are a widow who lies, a secretary who shakes, and a chemical company nobody trusts." "Archie," Wolfe said, "summon Saul Panzer. He must pursue Arden's trail immediately." "Already on it," I said. "Saul's digging through their bank filings as we speak." Cramer surged up again, pacing. "This don't help me now. 2 bodies in 2 days. What am I supposed to tell the commissioner?" "Tell him," Wolfe said coldly, "that the murderer has not yet finished. And if you persist in hysteria, you may be next." Cramer froze, cigar halfway to his mouth. "Next?" "Yes," Wolfe said. "The pattern is escalation. Bryce first, then Marston. Each death erases a voice. The third will be the man whose silence secures the conspiracy. Perhaps you, perhaps another. But it will come." The room went silent, except for the ticking clock. Cramer dropped heavily back into the chair, sweat glistening on his forehead. At 1 o'clock sharp, Fritz entered with lunch, veal cutlets, red cabbage, and a chilled Riesling. Wolfe announced the session adjourned and turned his chair toward the dining room. Cramer sputtered, but I waved him off. "Sorry, Inspector. Murder pauses for sauerkraut. You'll get your audience after dessert." Wolfe swept out and I followed, leaving Cramer fuming in the office with the weight of 2 corpses and a burned ledger pressing on his shoulders. He glared, but didn't answer. The storm wasn't gone, but for the moment, Wolfe had steered it into silence. It was exactly 11:08 the next morning when the office bell rang. Wolfe was upstairs tending the orchids, which meant I had the privilege of being ground floor reception. When I opened the door, Saul Panzer stood there, flat cap pulled low, raincoat buttoned tight, eyes steady as always. Saul never looked hurried, never looked rattled. If Manhattan ever crumbled into the Hudson, Saul would be the guy calmly walking across the bridge, shoes still dry. "Morning, Archie," he said in that quiet voice of his. "He home?" "Of course," I said. Where else would Wolfe be? Come in before the orchids drop their petals at the thought of a draft. We settled in the office while Wolfe finished his floral devotions. I poured Saul a coffee and he slid a folded envelope across the desk. He didn't waste words. "You wanted Arden Chemicals, I pulled threads." Wolfe arrived at 11:30 sharp, lowering himself into the yellow chair with the kind of sigh you'd expect from a monarch forced to deal with the peasants. I gave him the update, then passed Saul's envelope across. Wolfe slit it open, eyes narrowing as he scanned the documents. "Explain," he commanded. Saul nodded once. "Arden Chemicals is no chemical company. It's a shell, registered out of Delaware, no plant, no product. Bank records tie it to a law firm, Bryce and Marston. They used it to funnel payments." Payments from whom? Wolfe asked. Mob fronts, construction outfits, and politicians. The ledger that's missing would have listed them all. I pulled a bank statement before it got scrubbed and made certified copies. One's filed off-site. He tapped the document Wolfe was holding. Shows a transfer, $10,000, from Arden Chemicals to a councilman's re-election fund. Name's Harper. Wolfe let out a long, low "ha." He passed the sheet to me. Sure enough, the numbers were neat and tidy, and the name Harper stood out like a sore thumb. Councilman Harper, I said. I've seen his mug in the papers, always preaching about reform while making backroom deals. If he's in this stew, it explains why someone lit a match under Marston's safe. Wolfe shut his eyes, fingers pressed together. So, Bryce held proof that Arden was the conduit. Marston attempted to erase it. Both are dead. And Harper's name survives like a weed. Saul spoke again, calm as always. Harper's office made large deposits right after Bryce's firm cut checks through Arden. The trail isn't subtle. He wasn't just taking bribes. He was laundering through Bryce. I whistled. That would give Harper motive for both murders, and for framing Cramer, if discrediting the cops kept heat off City Hall. Exactly, Wolfe said. Inspector Cramer was meant to be the scapegoat. Harper remains untouched. Clever. Clever, I said, but sloppy. Leaving his name on a bank statement, that's like robbing a bank and leaving your driver's license at the scene. Arrogance breeds sloppiness, Wolfe murmured. He believed himself untouchable. At that moment, the office door burst open. Cramer stormed in, smoke curling from his cigar, eyes bloodshot. Wolfe, what the hell's this I hear about Harper? Don't play games with me. Inspector, Wolfe said, voice frosty, you will lower your tone or depart. Cramer slammed a fist on the desk. Don't start. If Harper's involved, I need to know now. The DA's breathing down my neck. You think I like taking the fall while a councilman eats steak dinners with mob money? I stepped in. Relax, Inspector. Saul just confirmed Arden Chemicals is Harper's piggy bank. The ledger tied him to Bryce. Now the ledger's ash, but a bank statement survived. Cramer gaped. You serious? Harper? As tuberculosis, I said, and just as rotten. He swore, pacing the rug like a caged bull. If this leaks, if the press gets it before we move, I'm finished. Then it must not leak, Wolfe said. Not yet. We require more. Arden may connect to Harper, but others fed at the trough. We must know who. Cramer jabbed a finger at him. Wolfe, if you're holding back, I swear. I hold nothing back, Wolfe cut him off. But I will not indulge your tantrums. You asked for my aid. Permit me to conduct it. The two of them glared across the desk, like heavyweight boxers waiting for the bell. I cleared my throat. If we're passing out advice, maybe we focus on the fact that Harper has motive. Bryce tried to blow the whistle and Marston tried to cover. That's two corpses pointing in one direction. Cramer growled but sat. So Harper killed them both? You saying that? I am saying, Wolfe replied, that Harper profited most. Whether he struck personally or through agents remains to be proved. But he is central. Saul slipped his hands into his coat pockets. I can keep digging. Arden's shell has more branches. Offshore accounts, maybe. Might take time. Wolfe inclined his head. Do so. Quietly. Cramer puffed his cigar furiously. Time? I don't have time. Internal Affairs wants me suspended by tomorrow. Then, Wolfe said, you had better pray Mr. Panzer is swift. The silence after that was heavy. Fritz entered with a tray. Beer for Wolfe, milk for me, black coffee for Saul. Wolfe lifted his glass with regal calm, ignoring Cramer's growl. I clinked my milk against Saul's cup. To Harper, I said dryly. May his chemical empire dissolve faster than Fritz's custard. Cramer didn't laugh, but Wolfe's eyes gleamed and I knew the noose was tightening. Dinner at the Brownstone is never a casual affair. Fritz treats it as high ceremony, and Wolfe treats it as religion. At exactly 8 o'clock, the table gleamed with silver and crystal, the sauerbraten steaming beside bowls of red cabbage and spätzle that would have made any mortal man forget about murder. But this wasn't an ordinary night. Not with 2 dead lawyers, a councilman's name smouldering in Saul's papers, and Wolfe doing his best impression of a stone Buddha. I waited until Fritz retired to the kitchen before starting in. That sauerbraten could make a man forgive his worst enemy, I said, buttering my roll. Unless, of course, that enemy happens to be sitting across the table holding back the one thing that might blow this case wide open. Wolfe's fork froze halfway to his mouth, his eyes, heavy-lidded, lifted with the kind of disdain usually reserved for wilted orchids. "Archie, must you?" "Must and will," I said cheerfully. "You've been nursing some deduction since Saul walked in, and it's about time you coughed it up. Cramer's ready to hang himself with his cigar smoke, Harper's out there laundering money like it's laundry day, and you're savouring cabbage while the rest of us are stewing." His fork descended, he chewed, he swallowed, then his voice thundered, shaking the plates. "Confound it, Archie! Your incessant impatience jeopardizes the integrity of the investigation. Discipline, man! Discipline!" I leaned back, grinning. There it is. The thunder. Knew it was coming. But here's the thing, boss. Discipline doesn't fill in blanks. You've got something. You're just too stubborn to share. His fists clenched on the tablecloth. "You presume too much." "Maybe," I said. "But I was in Bryce's office, remember? I saw the torn sheet. The man scribbled "ah" and choked before he could finish. Now we've got Marston dead, a burned ledger, and Saul dropping Harper in our laps courtesy of Arden Chemicals. I connect dots, and they spell Arden. Am I warm, or am I wasting oxygen? For a long moment he glared, nostrils flaring. Then slowly he leaned back, folded his arms, and let out a breath like a bellows. "Archie, the man Bryce tried to write down was not you, nor Arnold, nor any of the other absurdities you conjured. He began to write Arden." The words landed heavier than Fritz's cast-iron skillet. I stared at him. "So, you've known all along?" "I inferred," Wolfe corrected. Bryce's hand was interrupted. He would not squander his final scrawl on irrelevancies. Arden Chemicals, that was the word he meant. The missing ledger, the bank statement, Harper's fund, all converge. Only a fool could miss it. "Or an underpaid assistant," I said. "Glad you cleared that up." His eyes narrowed. "Do not mock. I withhold conclusions until they are ripe. To voice them prematurely risks contamination by speculation." "Sure," I said, stabbing a spätzle. "Meanwhile, the police are chewing their cigars to nubs. But fine. Arden it is. Now what?" "Now," Wolfe said, raising his glass of Riesling, "we continue to press. Arden is the fulcrum. Whoever destroyed the ledger is the hand that pressed the lever." I let that simmer while Fritz returned to clear plates and serve a pear tart glistening with brandy. Wolfe devoured it with the solemnity of a man communing with truth itself. I, meanwhile, replayed the pieces. Bryce dying in Cramer's office, Marston poisoned at his desk, a ledger burned to cinders, and a name scribbled in desperation. Arden. As Fritz poured coffee, Wolfe added, almost casually, "You will report to Saul. Instruct him to extend his inquiry. Not only Harper, but every transaction passing through Arden. We require the web entire." I grinned. Now we're cooking. A spiderweb of corruption, politicians and mobsters sticking to each strand. Sounds like your kind of bouquet. "Archie," Wolfe intoned, "you are incorrigible. Finish your coffee and write a memorandum. Title it Arden Hypothesis Confirmed." I saluted with my cup. "Yes, sir. Nothing like a sour Broughton summit to set the record straight." And with that, the dinner closed in ritual fashion. Wolfe pushing back his chair with a sigh, Fritz sweeping in with military precision, and me already planning how to word the memo without gloating too obviously. The case wasn't solved, not yet, but the name was out of Wolfe's mouth at last, and that was enough to sharpen the night air. If there's one man in New York who can weaponize a headline like a Thompson gun, it's Lon Cohen. He and I had been trading favors for years. He slipped me tidbits from the Gazette's morgue, and I occasionally gave him crumbs from Wolfe's table when the big man permitted, which is to say, rarely. Still, Lon knew better than most how to read the smoke before the fire trucks rolled. We met at the Gazette building just shy of 10 p.m., the presses downstairs thundering like artillery. The smell of ink and hot metal filled the air, and reporters swarmed the bullpen, sleeves rolled, ties crooked, shouting for copy boys. Lon waved me into his glass cubicle with a cigarette already burning between his fingers. "Archie," he said, leaning back, "you're dancing on dynamite." "Wouldn't be the first time," I said, sliding into the chair across from him. "What's the tune tonight?" He stubbed out the cigarette and lit another, nerves showing through the smooth patter. Arden Chemicals. Words out. Not from me, mind you. Somebody whispered to the rival sheets, and now City Hall's sweating bullets. Councilman Harper's been on the phone all day. He's telling anyone who'll listen that Nero Wolfe is fabricating evidence to protect his pet cop, Cramer. I whistled low. That's bold, even for Harper. Most guys wait until the noose is snug before blaming Wolfe. Lon grimaced. Bold or desperate. Either way, the narrative's moving. They're painting Wolfe as a crank, a gourmand with delusions of grandeur. If the public buys it, Harper walks clean. I leaned forward. What's the Gazette's angle? Lon tapped ash into the tray. Careful. We'll print smoke, but we won't light the match unless we're sure of the fire. But Archie, you better tell Wolfe that if Harper discredits him in the press, the case is sunk. No jury, no grand jury, no commissioner will touch it. I grinned. Don't worry. Wolfe may hate newspapers, but he knows ink can drown quicker than water. That's why I'm here. Lon studied me a moment, then lowered his voice. One more thing. Strictly off the record. Bryce left a sealed envelope at our offices a few hours before he died. Said it was insurance, addressed to me personally. It disappeared before I opened it. That jerked me upright. Disappeared? How? He shook his head. Clark swears he put it in my inbox. By the time I arrived, it was gone, no trace. I figured Bryce was just trying to plant a puff piece for his next case, but after his murder, I think it was dynamite, and somebody knew enough to steal it. I sat back, whistling again. So, the man about to testify leaves an envelope with the Gazette, and it vanishes. Meanwhile, his ledger burns and his partner takes a cyanide cocktail. That's not coincidence, Lon. That's choreography. Lon's jaw tightened. I know, but we don't print choreography. We print facts, and right now, facts are thin. If Wolfe can prove what was in that envelope, he wins. If not, Harper buries him. We sat in silence for a beat, the presses pounding below like a reminder that stories wait for no man. Finally, Lon stubbed out his cigarette and said, Archie, I'm telling you because I trust you. But if this breaks wrong, the Gazette can't save Wolfe. Ink cuts both ways. I stood, straightening my hat. Message received. Wolfe won't like it, but he'll chew it over. He always does. Lon smirked. Tell him the Gazette isn't his enemy, but we can't be his shield either. He'll have to fight this one in public and win. By the time I returned to the brownstone, it was close to midnight. Wolfe was in his chair, eyes closed, lips pursed as though dreaming about béarnaise sauce. I laid the news on his desk. Harper's on the warpath, I said. He's calling you a fraud. The papers are sniffing smoke, and Lon says the story could flip any second. Wolfe opened his eyes, narrowed them, and rumbled, Phooey, Harper flails. Maybe, but here's the kicker. Bryce left a sealed envelope at the Gazette. It vanished. Lon never saw the contents. That got him. Wolfe sat forward, hands gripping the chair arms. An envelope, he echoed. Insurance, of course. Of course, I said. Which means we've got another missing piece to the puzzle. Ledger burned, envelope stolen. Somebody's tidying up like a maid on double overtime. Wolfe rang for Fritz, who appeared with a late tray. Stilton, crackers, and a fresh bottle of beer. Wolfe poured, sipped, and spoke with sudden conviction. Archie. The envelope held the names Bryce feared to speak aloud. That is why he entrusted it to the Gazette. Publicity was his shield. When he was silenced, the thief ensured the shield would not rise. I grinned. And if we find who lifted the envelope, we find who feared it most. Precisely, Wolfe said. He closed his eyes again, muttering in Latin. I didn't catch it all, but I knew enough. Ink and ash were two sides of the same erasure. Someone had tried to burn the truth in one place and steal it in another. I poured myself a glass of milk, leaned on the desk and said, Looks like Harper's bluffing with half a hand. If we can prove the envelope tied him to Arden, he's finished. If not, he paints you as the fraud, and the city buys it. Wolfe didn't answer. He was too busy savouring his beer and planning the next move. But I knew one thing. Tomorrow, the fight wouldn't just be in the courts or the precinct. It would be in the papers, in headlines screaming from kiosks, shaping the minds of every voter and juror in the city. And if Wolfe hated one thing more than orchids wilting, it was having his name dragged through the mud by a politician with ink to spare. If Wolfe ever envied a judge's gavel, he never said so. But when he wanted a room hushed, He could do it with nothing more than the lift of a finger. That night in the office, with the rain dripping from the eaves and neon flickering through the blinds, he didn't even need the finger. He simply filled his yellow chair, monumental and immovable, and the silence spread. Across from him, the suspects and spectators lined the room like a jury. Mrs. Bryce, tight-lipped and jewelled, Miss Hale, pale and wilted, Councilman Harper, polished but sweating, and Inspector Cramer hunched forward with his cigar grinding itself to dust. Saul Pantzer and Lon Cohen had seats on the flanks, observers and evidence-bearers both. I stood at my post by the typewriter, notebook ready, milk glass within reach. "Ladies and gentlemen," Wolfe began, his voice rolling slow and solemn, "the matter is finished. The facts are aligned. Only one conclusion remains." Mrs. Bryce gave a strangled sigh. Harper shifted in his chair, the gold watch chain glinting like it was trying to betray him. Wolfe's eyes moved from face to face. "2 men are dead. Nathaniel Bryce, poisoned in Inspector Cramer's office. Charles Marston, poisoned in his own, his safe burned to ash. Both deaths sought to erase testimony and evidence. Both deaths served a single beneficiary." Cramer's cigar flared. "Spit it, Wolfe." "Patience, Inspector," Wolfe rumbled. "This is not theatre, though some in this room confuse politics with performance." His gaze landed on Harper, who stiffened. Wolfe lifted a hand toward me. "Archie, read the memorandum, if you please." I picked up the sheet and obliged. Subject: Arden Chemicals. Observation: funds laundered through the company to political accounts. Evidence: bank statement, transfer of $10,000 to Councilman Harper's re-election fund. I set it down. "Neat as Fritz's kitchen ledger." Wolfe continued. "Bryce sought to expose this corruption. He prepared a ledger, an accounting of the payments. Knowing the peril, he made a copy. That copy he placed in a sealed envelope, delivered to Mr. Cohen at the Gazette." Lon nodded grimly. "And stolen before I laid eyes on it." "Precisely," Wolfe said. "Who would know to steal it? Only one who feared exposure, only one whose name the ledger contained." Mrs. Bryce dabbed her eyes. Miss Hale looked away. Harper cleared his throat. "Supposition. Nothing but conjecture." Wolfe's voice dropped to a growl. "Supposition. Phooey. Consider. Bryce was lured into Inspector Cramer's office. Why there? Because geography condemned the inspector. The act was not only murder, but defamation. Harper maneuvered Bryce into that office under pretext of safety, then poisoned him. When Marston threatened to profit from the same ledger, Harper silenced him too and burned the safe. Yet fire is an imperfect servant. One scrap survived, bearing the words Arden Chemicals. He paused, letting the words settle like smoke. And Bryce, with his last strength, began to write Arden before death cut him off. I watched Harper closely. The polish was cracking, sweat pooling at his collar. Cramer growled, pointing his cigar like a weapon. "So it's him, Harper, all along." "Indeed," Wolfe said. "Harper alone possessed motive for both murders. Harper alone profited from both silences. Bryce dead, Marston dead, ledger gone, envelope stolen. Every path leads to Harper." Harper surged to his feet. "This is a frame. Lies and fantasies spun by a glutton and his hired snoop." "Sit," Wolfe commanded, the word booming like a hammer. Harper sat. Wolfe turned to Saul. "Mr. Pantzer, the bank records." Saul produced the folder, neat as always, and handed it over. Wolfe spread the pages across his desk. "Here," he said, stabbing a line with his finger. "Transfers from Arden to Harper's fund. Here, another. And here, a payment to an associate who then donated under his own name. The web is complete." Harper's voice broke. "You can't... Those records." "Authentic," Saul said quietly. "I copied them myself." Lon Cohen added, "And the Gazette stands ready to print once Wolfe gives the word. Front page, above the fold." That did it. Harper's hands shook, the watch chain clinking against his vest. He tried a final bluff. "Even if this nonsense were true, it proves nothing about murder." Wolfe leaned forward, eyes glinting. "On the contrary, it proves everything. You feared Bryce's testimony. You feared Marston's opportunism. You feared the ledger and the envelope. And you used geography, Inspector Cramer's office, to shift blame. That, councilman, is not merely corruption. It is homicide, twice. The room went still. Rain pattered at the windows. Cramer rose, face red but triumphant. "Well, what do you say now, Harper?" Harper sagged. His voice cracked. "Bryce was a fool. He was going to drag us all down. I had no choice." Cramer pounced. "Confession! That's a confession!" Wolfe lifted a hand. "Enough. Inspector, the man is yours." Stebbins, waiting in the hall, entered with cuffs. Harper didn't fight. His shoulders slumped, his chain finally still. They hauled him out, his protests weak, his polish gone. Silence lingered after they left. Mrs. Bryce sobbed into her handkerchief. Miss Hale exhaled like a punctured balloon. Lon scribbled notes furiously, already shaping tomorrow's headline. I poured Wolfe a fresh beer, slid it across, and raised my glass of milk. "Well, boss, another feast of facts. You sure know how to serve 'em hot." He sipped, eyes half shut, and murmured, "Justice, Archie, is rarely clean. It is a forced unveiling of rot. Pfui." And with that, he leaned back, closed his eyes, and let the orchids upstairs wait another hour. The trouble with cases, especially ones that run to multiple corpses and city hall-level corruption, is that they don't end with a neat bow. They end the way a storm does, lots of wreckage on the street, wet shoes, and the feeling you'll be drying things out for days. But Wolfe had his bow all right. It came in the form of a fat retainer check from a very red-faced but ultimately relieved Inspector Cramer, who growled something about Wolfe being an insufferable jackass before stalking out. I didn't bother to remind him that he'd said the same thing about 27 cases ago. That left the brownstone in its favourite posture, smug silence. Wolfe took it upstairs to the plant rooms promptly at 4. Orchids don't care if you've toppled a councilman, and Wolfe doesn't care to miss their company. I watched him lumber off to the elevator with the dignity of an emperor who had ordered an execution and was now ready to inspect his roses. In his case, orchids, and the executions were legal, but the spirit was the same. So, I had the office to myself, and the typewriter for company. That's our ritual. Wolfe thinks. I clatter. I tapped out the final memorandum for the files, noting for posterity that Councilman Harper had confessed under pressure, that Bryce had tried to scratch his last word in Cramer's office, and that Marston's safe had gone up in flames but not fast enough to hide ardent chemicals. I finished with the note Wolfe had dictated earlier. Justice was not triumphant, but it was adequate. If you're looking for poetry, don't look in Wolfe's case summaries. By the time the orchids had been fed and admired, Fritz had the kitchen perfumed with apple strudel. The man has a gift. Even the ashes of corruption smell sweeter once Fritz starts on cinnamon. Dinner was sauerbraten, the sauce of velvet pool that Wolfe savoured with the satisfaction of a man whose enemies had been crushed by facts and whose palate was being honoured by genius. I had 2 helpings myself, not because I'd cracked the case, Saul Panzer and Wolfe between them had done most of the heavy lifting, but because Fritz's sauerbraten is what keeps me loyal when Wolfe snarls about discipline. Over dessert, Wolfe leaned back, the famous globe of him resettling into the chair, and took a long pull of beer. He made the sound he makes when the world fails to impress him. Pfui. It was the final word on Harper, on City Hall, on the mess that had left 2 lawyers dead and the press buzzing like flies at a picnic. I sipped my coffee and studied him. You know, it's a funny picture. Cramer rescued, Harper disgraced, Bryce and Marston both feeding worms. And you still say, pfui. What does a case have to do to rate something warmer? His eyes slid shut, the lids heavy as stone doors. Archie, there is no triumph in rot, only relief that it has been scraped away. That was Wolfe at his most lyrical. If you ever need a Hallmark card that reads "Congratulations on your indictment," I can suggest a draftsman. Fritz appeared with the strudel, cut in precise wedges, the crust golden and sugared. I speared a bite and let the apple and spice remind me that some things in life are incorruptible. Wolfe took his portion with all the ceremony of a man anointed, lifted his beer, and went back to silence. The clock ticked, the city buzzed distantly, but the brownstone was itself again. And me? I leaned back and thought about the geography of murder. It had started in Cramer's office, Temple of Law and Order, and ended with Harper led away in cuffs. If you can kill a man on Cramer's blotter, you can kill him anywhere. It was a reminder that the guardians of the law have targets on their backs as big as anyone's, maybe bigger. But that was philosophy, and philosophy doesn't fill a stomach or pay a retainer. Wolfe had both covered. Tomorrow morning he'd be back at the Orchids at 9 sharp, and I'd be at the typewriter finishing the casebook. The world would still be crooked, City Hall still full of weasels, and Fritz still baking things that made it survivable. That's the way of the brownstone. Cases end, meals resume, orchids bloom, Cramer rages, Wolfe mutters, and I drink my milk. Routine is our only real victory. So I raised my cup toward Wolfe's glass. To order restored. He didn't open his eyes. He just lifted his beer an inch in acknowledgement, muttered another pfui, and let the orchids upstairs wait for him until morning. The storm outside had passed, and the brownstone was calm again.